Hello and welcome to Real Obscure. My name is Kevin H. Shaw, and tonight I'll be discussing a movie that has everything. Computers, a demonic overlord, car chasers, imps, a serial killer, a giant stone ape, 80s dancing, an angel, 8 directors, 9 writers, and full frontal nudity in a PG-rated movie. From 1984, it's the cinematic Swiss Army knife, The Dungeon Master. The Dungeon Master was the brainchild of the mighty Charles Band. I've already discussed his extensive career in the Real Obscure episode covering Eliminators, so be sure to check that out for a more in-depth look at his history as a filmmaker. But essentially, Band was a pioneer in the home video market, with his Empire Pictures and later Full Moon Productions pumping out new titles, often horror, sci-fi or fantasy, for this rapidly growing market, and producing such classics as Reanimator, the Puppet Master series, and the Ghoulies franchise. Full Moon is still going to this day and continues to produce genre and cult movies, exactly the kind of thing we lap up here at Real Obscure. Inspired by the release of Tron, and notice I didn't say success of, Band came up with the idea of a computer-themed movie, but also seeing the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons, decided to create a movie that welded the two concepts into a single story. Except the movie actually has about 9 different stories. But we'll come back to that. The movie stars Jeffrey Byron as Paul. Byron began his career as a child actor, appearing most notably in the Twilight Zone's The Bewitching Pool, followed by roles in cult TV shows The Fantastic Journey and Wonder Woman, plus roles in movies including Falling Down, Bionic Ever After, and the 2009 reboot of Star Trek. This is one of his many collaborations with Band, who he most recently worked with in the ongoing movie series The Resonator and its sequels. Gwen is played by Leslie Wing. She has a resume that includes guest spots in a variety of TV shows, including Knight Rider, The Fall Guy, Moonlighting, and Babylon 5, but is best known for her appearance in Peter Jackson's The Frighteners and her recurring role of Lucille Bolton in the High School Musical movie series. The movie's main antagonist, Mestima, is played by Richard Moll. He's probably best known for his TV role of Bull in Mr. Plinkett's favourite TV show Night Court, but also had a successful movie career, appearing in cult favourites The Sword and the Sorcerer, House, and Night Train to Terror. So, what's it all about? The movie opens with what's very clearly a dream sequence, and we know this because it's all shot at half speed with a wind machine going, and there's dry ice smoke everywhere. We see Paul, played by Jeffrey Byron, lying on a bed, electrode pads attached to his temples, awakening in a strange room to find a woman in red, played by Gina Calabrese, standing over him. She smiles and walks from the room, and he follows, pursuing her through a series of tunnels and storm drains, until he eventually finds her in a smoke-filled room, where she undresses. And yes, this is a PG-rated movie with full frontal nudity because 1980s, and then she reclines upon a bed. He joins her, but their lovemaking is interrupted when a group of mutants enter the room, clubbing Paul to the floor and dragging the naked dream woman away. And then the titles roll, which include the movie's original title, Rage War. Well, actually that's the second title, as it was originally intended to be called Rage War: The Challenges of Excalibrate. Yes, Charles, I once produced a movie called Metal Storm: The Destruction of Jared's Sin, and now I want to call this one Rage War: The Challenges of Excalibrate. Band was always one for a catchy title. Anyway, now I'm sure you're all dying to find out why Paul was taking part in what looked like a strange sleep experiment. Was he somehow transported into his dream? By whom? And who was the mystery nudie woman? Will he be able to rescue her? And what were those creatures? And who is commanding them? Well, we'll answer those questions right now as we take a trip into the spoiler zone. Paul wakes up. That's it. That's the explanation. Yes, it was all a dream that was presumably added to pad the runtime and also include some nudity in an attempt to make you keep watching in the hopes of seeing more naked women. Spoiler, there are no more naked women in this movie. Anyway, the movie then begins proper, with an overarching storyline revolving around computer expert Paul, who, in a rather prescient bit of storytelling, has invented a computer system, the XCalBR8, thanks Charles Catchy Titles Band, which is essentially ChatGPT. Thanks to a pair of glasses that include augmented reality software, think Meta glasses or Google Glass, he is able to communicate with Cal, as he calls his system, and it in turn is able to use the glasses to display information to him and help him with his job as a computer repair technician. After completing a particularly difficult job, which he aces thanks to Cal, he talks briefly with his co-worker before setting off to run home. As in the thing you do when you move your legs really quickly. This is a plot point we will come back to. So he sprints home and uses Cal to change the crossing lights so he doesn't have to stop, and then hacks into an ATM to withdraw some cash to buy some flowers. He's such a bad boy. Paul is in love with Glenn? That would be an entirely different movie. Paul is in love with Gwen, played by Leslie Wing. Gwen is an aspiring actor and dancer, and we're introduced to her in a great bit of 80s aerobic style modern dance, which she's practicing with a group of other aspiring actors and dancers, which she then just cuts short, thankfully. Paul wants to marry Gwen, but his overdependence on Cal, which even included consulting it as to whether he should propose, is a constant source of annoyance to her, and she feels she'd be playing second fiddle to his digital assistant. Despite Paul's efforts to have her get along with Cal, Gwen, quite rightly, finds the whole thing weird, especially as Paul has given Cal a sexy robot woman's voice, and so she decides to go to bed. Paul awakens in a forest, where he finds Gwen bathing under a waterfall, and no, before you get too excited, she's fully clothed. And when he tries to get to her, he finds his skin begins to blister and he's trapped behind an invisible barrier, which then turns into a rock wall. And then he wakes up. So that's 2 pointless dream sequences now. Back in the real world, he discovers Gwen is no longer in their bed, and running into the living room, which is full of dry ice smoke and he doesn't seem to notice, he is magically teleported into a disused quarry, where he finds Gwen chained to a rock. We're then introduced to our villain, Mistima, Richard Moll, who explains that he is an immortal who is bored, and believes Paul, with his new magic of technology, may prove to be a worthy adversary, and so forces him to face his 7 challenges. He transforms Gwen's outfit into something more suitable for a damsel in distress, and then provides Paul with a wrist-mounted version of Cal, and a suit of armour that's, well, the best way I can describe it is crap Tron cosplay. Seriously, it just looks awful. It's part studded tunic, part unitard, and part cricket pad. The worst part is the thigh pads are connected to the tunic, which not only causes the strips to buckle and bulge when he moves, but also makes it look like he's wearing some kind of Mad Max crotchless lingerie. Anyway, dubbing him Excalibrate, which Paul realises is Cal's name, XCalBR8, well, not really. Mistima plunges him into a series of adventures in which he must rely on his physical prowess, wits, and ingenuity. Nah, not really. All he ever does is ask Cal to fix the problem for him, which usually involves zapping enemies with Cal's somehow now acquired laser powers. The first of these challenges is Ice Gallery. It was written and directed by Rosemary Turco. Her only other credit was for the 1983 drama Scarred, and I haven't been able to find any other information on her, so it appears she retired from filmmaking after this. Paul and Gwen find themselves in a cavern full of frozen evil entities, including Jack the Ripper, a werewolf, Bloody Mary, and Albert Einstein? When Gwen begins to freeze, Mestima turns up the heat, and these frozen fiends come to life. Gwen is grabbed by Jack the Ripper, but Paul is able to defeat an evil samurai by programming Cal to electrocute him, and then throws a boulder at Jack the Ripper. The two flee as Paul asks Cal for help, and then, despite not answering him, he somehow knows that they need to find the ice crystal. They do so, Einstein is holding it, and then they throw it into the melee and the evil creatures are frozen. Or destroyed. I don't know. The sequence is barely 4 minutes long, and honestly I've seen commercials with better plots. They turn up, get menaced, Paul uses Cal to help him, and then they return to the quarry, having passed the test. After arguing with Mestima for a while, Paul is then teleported to the next challenge. Demons of the Dead was written and produced by John Buechler. Predominantly a special effects and makeup artist, he worked on a number of movies with Band, including Reanimator, go check out my episode on that, From Beyond, the Ghoulie series, and Eliminators, which I also covered in an earlier episode, plus Troll, Friday the 13th Part 7, both of which he directed, and Hatchet. This story sees Paul enter the realm of the dead, where a puppet monster named Ratspit commands the legions of the dead to attack him. Paul fights them, but then Ratspit summons the Revenant of Paul. Paul, however, remains unfazed when he is told that this is his destiny, using science to state that this is just one possible future. He then utters the line, "I reject your reality and substitute my own," which fans of Mythbusters will no doubt be familiar with. Mestima judges him to have bested the challenge and returns him to the quarry. The two argue again, and when Mestima gets handy with Gwen, Paul uses Cal to shoot a laser beam at him, at which point Mestima summons an animated dragon spirit, and so Paul does the same. And then the dragons sort of fight, and then Mestima banishes both. I'm sure you've noticed by now that there are a lot of scenes where things just sort of happen, and then just sort of end. Interestingly though, the dragon animations were done by Disney of all people. Anyway, Mestima, ever the master of the Segway, asks if Paul fancies some music, and then summons some demonic choral wailing of his own composition. Paul, using Cal, again, counters by playing some awful synth pop, which rightly angers Mestima, who then punishes him in the worst possible way by making him go to a Wasp concert. Now, for the younger people here, Wasp were, and well still are, a heavy metal band who rose to fame in the 80s due to their shock rock performances, which would include scenes featuring semi-naked women and raw meat being thrown into the audience. I'd say they were very much inspired by Alice Cooper's performances, but if you're too young to remember Wasp, then you certainly won't remember Alice Cooper, so maybe if I say it's emulating the Grand Guignol performances of the 19th century, then, look, just go Google it. Wasp courted controversy with the release of their first single, Animal, Flip Like a Beast, and no, that's not the actual title, and became part of the whole satanic panic thing in the 80s. Which saw heavy metal being targeted as the devil's music, thanks to some dubious reporting and mass moral outrage by a small group of, well, deluded idiots who concocted theories and conspiracies regarding a secret cabal of devil worshippers who were committing a series of murders or something. Like all conspiracy theories, it really doesn't make much sense, and I could spend literally hours pointing out how nonsensical this all was and how barcodes and Dungeons and Dragons all got dragged into this steaming pile of bollocks just because Ian and his bandmates wanted to stop being famous and instead wanted to sell shoes. Brucey bonus points for anybody who gets that reference. Anyway, this section, Heavy Metal, was written and directed by Charles Band, and sees Wasp singer Blackie Lawless threatening Gwen, who is in a box on stage wearing a non-more 80s metal ripped bodysuit and performing their terrible song Tormentor. When Paul is knocked to the ground by Lawless, who then transforms into Mestima, he uses Cal to emit a sonic frequency that destroys the band, including a brilliant scene where the drummer explodes, just like Mick Shrimpton in This Is Spinal Tap. Paul returns to the quarry, he and Mestima argue, yada yada yada, next story segment. Stone Canyon Giant was written and directed by David Allen. Allen was a highly successful stop-frame animator, whose works included Equinox, I covered that back in an earlier episode of Real Obscure, Flesh Gordon, sorry Mr. Martini's still not doing that one, The Howling, Batteries Not Included, and Young Sherlock Holmes. He worked extensively with Empire and later Full Moon Pictures, including providing effects for entries in the Puppet Master series and the Demonic Toys movies. Most recently, his passion project, The Primevals, which he began developing back in the 60s, was completed after his death and was released in 2023. In this segment, the unconscious Paul has Cal stolen from his wrist by two small cavemen, played by Phil Fondacaro of Willow, Garbage Pail Kids movie and Troll fame, and Sal Fondacaro, Under the Rainbow and Return of the Jedi. He gives chase and recovers Cal, only to be then menaced by a giant stone ape. He uses Cal's laser to shoot the gem in the ape's forehead and is then transported back to the quarry. Of all the segments in this movie, this is probably the best, which, granted, isn't saying much. But David Allen was an absolute master of his craft, and the special effects here, with the great matte painting and superb stop-motion work, really make this section stand out from the rest of the stick somebody in a polystyrene cave and have a creature menace them a bit that forms the majority of the movie's screen time. It's also interesting that according to some reports, this was the first challenge in the movie's original cut, which explains why Paul looks so bemused when he discovers Cal can shoot lasers. But I guess they decided the nudie lady in awesome animation in this scene saw the movie peak too early and so moved it later into the story in an attempt to keep the audience hooked. Anyway, Quarry, Mestima, Temptation with Money and 80s Ladies, next challenge. This segment, entitled Slasher, was written by Jeffrey Byron himself and directed by Steve Ford. Better known as Stephen Stafford, he directed predominantly for television, and his credits include episodes of Viper, The Cape, and the criminally now forgotten Nowhere Man. Slasher begins with Paul, again, awakening to face a new problem. But unlike the other tales, this is set in contemporary LA, and after finding tomorrow's newspaper that shows Gwen has been killed by a serial killer, Paul sets off in an attempt to save her. Escaping from the police by using Cal's laser to remove his handcuffs and then tell him where she is, he then uses his awesome running powers to arrive in time to save her from the killer. It's another welcome change from the cave full of monsters scenes, but don't worry, we've more of that to come. And it does feel like an extremely short proof of concept for a potential movie. I could see this being filmed as a giallo-like feature, where future knowledge warns the hero of an upcoming murder, and he has to not only stop it from happening, but also persuade those around him that it is going to happen. But, well, it's not really developed here, even with the longer runtime. And then we get into the weirder moments of why Gwen doesn't remember the whole kidnapping by an immortal thing, or is this really Gwen, or, well, you get the idea. quarry argument next. Cavebeast was written and directed by Peter Manoogian. If that name rings some bells for you, it's because I discussed his career at length in my episode on Eliminators. If you're a fan of Empire Pictures movies, then go check that one out, as you will love it. Paul awakens, again, outside a cave, again, where there's a monster, again, throwing crystals at him. In a shocking plot twist, and brace yourself as there's more to come, the crystals act exactly like Cal's lasers, and when Cal informs Paul it is impossible to plot a correct trajectory to hit the creature, he instead throws rocks at it, tricking it into collapsing the ceiling down onto itself. But in another shocking twist, the creature turns into an angelic being who is now dying and explains to the regret-filled Paul that all he had to do was walk out of the cavern. He is returned to the quarry, where Mestima judges Paul has failed, and then kills him and Gwen, before laughing maniacally and then speaking directly to the viewer, asking if they think they can defeat him in a series of new challenges. Only joking. Sad Paul returns to the quarry and is sad. Anyway, Mestima then sends him off to another challenge, despite him failing the previous one. I don't know if at this point they'd just given up or assumed we, the audience, would have, because this really doesn't make any sense unless Mestima set Paul up to murder the angel lady or something, but f*** it, let's just push through to the end. Desert Pursuit was written and directed by Ted Nicolau. He's probably most famous for the Subspecies movie series, but he also directed Terrorvision and Puppet Master vs. Demonic Toys. This time around we're eschewing the fantasy setting for a post-apocalyptic one, in which Gwen, dressed very much like one of the cast of The Road Warrior, and Paul must contend with a bunch of scavengers, racing around in futuristic cars and shooting lasers at each other. Why Mad Max rip-offs always have pew-pew laser rifles in them is beyond me, but there you go. The challenge ends when control of Paul's vehicle is overridden and he and Gwen crash head first into a car controlled by Mestima, with both exploding. That doesn't exactly sound like much of a victory to me, but I'm sure somebody will argue that at this point Mestima is just having too much fun messing with Paul. I don't know, and neither do any of the 8 scriptwriters. Returning to the quarry, Paul argues with Mestima and challenges him to a real fight, with no magic and no technology, which Mestima accepts. They fight to the brink of a lava pit, and of course Mestima then cheats and uses his magic to loosen the rocks below them in an attempt to send them both plunging to their deaths, because causing Paul's head to explode or teleporting him directly into the fiery depths wouldn't be a better idea. Anyway, Paul is able to push Mestima to his death, but calls upon Cal to shoot a hard light beam toward him, which he then uses to gently help himself up from the slightly precarious position he was in. With Mestima defeated, he and Gwen are transported back to his apartment, where Gwen, who has talked it over with Cal, agrees to marry him. The end. Now I have to add my standard disclaimer here and say that everybody involved in the Dungeon Master has had more success as a movie maker than I've ever had, and congratulations to them all for getting this made. But the Dungeon Master is just a mess of a movie, or 7, 8 or 9 movies depending how you want to count it. When I tell you it's not even a real movie but instead is just scenes where things happen, well, I know you're going to argue that that's what movies are, but your brain understands what I'm saying there even if you don't. There's no progression or character growth or any kind of 3-act structure moments. Paul wakes up somewhere, asks Cal for help, solves the problem, or doesn't in the case of the last 2 challenges, and then returns to Mestima, where the whole thing just repeats. In a real movie, Paul would overcome his dependence on Cal, realising he doesn't need its advice and instead using his smarts to outwit Mestima. Okay, so you could argue that is what happens, but people punching each other into submission doesn't have the same satisfying outcome as it would have had Paul somehow figured out a way to defeat Mestima using his own brain power. The whole thing is set up for this to happen, and there's even a bit where Gwen talks about zapping Mestima, who doesn't understand the term, showing there are gaps in his knowledge that Paul could exploit to trick him. But no, it just goes with a badly choreographed fight, Mestima's magic failing to beat Paul, and then Paul still needing Cal to save his sorry ass. Now, if I was being cynical, I'd say this was never intended to be an actual movie. I think it's a backdoor showreel that they just decided to put out anyway to recoup some of their losses. Think about it. You're Charles Band looking to get funding for a movie. You want a proof of not just one concept, but also something that showcases the talents of your pool of directors, writers, and crew. So what better way to highlight their different styles and approaches than having a package that does that all in one movie? You want somebody who can do zombie horror? Look, here's John Blucher, showing you just that. No? How about a Lost Kingdom magical fantasy with stop-frame animation? Look at that stone monkey! No? Okay, so what about a contemporary thriller with a protagonist trying to save his girlfriend from a serial killer? Steve Ford's got you on that one. Don't like it? Okay, so how about this? You know what would make The Road Warrior even better? Pew pew lasers! Look, let me show you. One of my many jobs back in the day saw me working with a number of voice talents, and part of that casting process often involved demo reels, usually on tapes because old man, where they'd do their best fancy cowboy, sad robot, or flirty donkey voices to showcase what they could offer, and that's exactly what this movie feels like. It's a series of barely connected shorts filmed with the same cast and mostly the same crew, intended solely to demonstrate what Empire Pictures had to offer to a prospective investor. But honestly, part of me doesn't mind, because this movie is one of those absolutely mesmerising, baffling works that just leaves your head spinning in the best possible way. There are highs, such as the great stop-frame animation work, the fun puppets and makeup, and lows, of which there are far too many to discuss here. But even being so uneven, it's still an entertaining watch if you're a fan of good bad movies. It doesn't get boring, mostly, the visuals are cool in an 80s way, and Richard Moll is a great bad guy. It's very much the kind of thing you'd expect from Empire Pictures. They may not have always had the money, or indeed the talent, to always realise their ambitions, and oftentimes they'd set themselves up to fail because the brilliance of their concepts simply couldn't be fully exploited. But let me tell you this, I'd much rather somebody swing for the fences and miss than just play it safe. And on that note, thanks for listening, and I'll see you all on the next episode of Real Obscure. This episode of Real Obscure was written, produced and zapped with pew pew lasers by me, Kevin H. Shaw. Be sure to stick around for the end titles trivia, where I'll share some additional behind the scenes facts about the movie, including a connection to everybody's favourite Dark Knight detective. Please be sure to like, share and subscribe, and turn notifications on. You can share your thoughts below in the comments section, or email the show at hellorealobscure@gmail.com. You'll find the website at realobscurepod.com, and I'm on Blue Sky using the handle @realobscurepod. The Dungeon Master, aka Rage War, aka Rage War The Trials of Excalibrate, aka the Empire Pictures demo reel, is copyright 1984. All content here is used for educational and commentary purposes under Section 107 of the Copyright Act, fair use, and remains the property of the respective copyright holder. Presented here for the purposes of critique, commentary and discussion. No copyright infringement is intended, so please don't sue me or make me listen to Wasp again.